on this Friday morning. 11 minutes past 9 it is. We began the week talking to Hawke's Bay anaesthetist Peter Lloyd, a man who's made it his mission to understand the conflicting statements being made about the future of the planet. He told us there were three big issues facing all of us: oil depletion, climate change and overpopulation. The end of plentiful oil especially, he said, posed the most fundamental threat to the way we live, because so much of the way we live is based on oil. Our food production, our exports, big earners like the tourism industry all need a secure supply of reasonably priced oil, and that is under threat. What he wanted was a government inquiry into peak oil and what this country will do once the oil starts running out. Well, chances are he won't get one. But we decided to bring some of the politicians together to see if we could find out some of the answers to the questions he posed anyway. Joining me now from the government, David Parker, from National, Nick Smith, from the Greens, Jeanette Fitzsimons, and from the Maori Party, Pita Sharples. And because this was all sparked by Peter Lloyd, we invited him to listen in too. Good morning to all of you.
Good morning, Linda. Good morning, Linda.
David Parker, let me start with you, since you're the one with the authority at the moment. Labor went into the last election promising to set up an interdepartmental working party to assess the effects of peak oil. Have you done it?
Well, yes, we have. We've announced that we're preparing a national energy strategy, and obviously consideration of the future reliability of oil supplies will be central to that, as will questions like what we do towards advancing biofuels as replacements to land transport fuels.
But who's part of who's feeding information into this national strategy that you're working on?
Well, the primary departments will be ECA, Ministry for the Environment, and the Ministry of Economic Development, but of course other departments like the Ministry of Agriculture are important when it comes to assessing what are our potential fuel sources for biofuels.
How much store do you put into biofuels?
Well, we've got currently a target of 2 petajoules of renewable sources of energy source going into land transport fuels by 2012. That's not a particularly aggressive target because it only accounts for 1% of our total transport fuels. So I expect that target will be increased rather than accepted as it is.
Now remind us again, because there's a lot of jargon in this area and listeners will easily get lost. So your target is 1% of target fuels transport fuels by when?
The target is actually 2 petajoules of energy, which is equivalent to about 1% of our transport fuels by 2012. But I think you'll see that target go up rather than be accepted in its present form.
Well, Peter Lloyd told us at the beginning of the week, the scientific consensus is that the point of maximum oil production is somewhere between 2005 and 2008. In other words, this could be it. What do your officials tell you about that?
Well, they say a couple of things. First of all, they say that where the actual date is uncertain. And I think it is proper to reflect that we've been told that peak oil would be 2005, and it's now being pushed out to 2012 on those figures. It could even be later. But from my perspective, I'm really not so concerned about the actual date, because I accept the concept that within my lifetime we're going to have to change from our present fuel sources towards others.
Do you accept also that while the bureaucrats and policymakers are debating about the date and wishing that it is 2012 rather than 2005 or 2008, that's all a distraction, if you like, because every year that passes puts us a year further behind the plan we're going to need to cope post whatever date?
I think that whether you approach the issue from peak oil or from climate change concerns or concerns about energy security or concerns about rising prices, because whether or not it's peaking, it's getting more expensive to find what's left, I think you're led to the same conclusion, and that is that you need to take steps now.
Jeanette Fitzsimons, what's your view on what you've just heard?
Well, I strongly support the Minister's wish to proceed a lot faster with biofuels. But if we think that we're going to be able to produce something alternative just to put in our tanks instead of oil and carry on with the rate of energy use we've got now, we are dreaming. New Zealand simply cannot produce enough biofuel to just put in conventional tanks and still be a food producer as we are now. And if we can't do it, then certainly the rest of the world can't do it. So we have got to change quite fundamentally the way we operate. Peak oil is not just about what do we use in our tanks, it's about what happens to our trade when international transport gets more expensive, when the world, there's going to be even less market for unpruned logs, which are low price now, if you've got to put a lot of oil into taking them around the world. Countries may not be able to afford to buy as much of our dairy produce as they do now. It will have major impacts on our tourism. We've got to start planning for a different kind of economic future where we prepare for those changes, where we look at where we've got strategic advantages, where we look at how we can become more self-reliant in some areas, because if we just go on the way we are, we're going to fall over a cliff at some stage.
I mean, the picture that you paint, which is the one that Peter Lloyd told us about earlier in the week, is deeply challenging, because for a country that relies on exports for its income and that is so far away, I mean, you can't drive to the Asian markets or to the markets in the Middle East. If oil becomes scarce and therefore expensive, then none of our exports are going to be competitively attractive, are they?
Well, there are some new technologies that we need to get into soon, and people just dismiss them as futuristic. But there are ships now that get half of their motive power from the wind without much loss in speed or reliability. They've been built in Germany and Japan. They're high-tech machinery. We can build on that until even more than half comes from the wind. It's not guys holding on wet ropes on the deck in dangerous conditions like the 16th century. It's computer-controlled aerofoils and smart computer systems, and that's one direction that our international trade may well want to go.
I mean, the Greens have got this idea that we should have some kind of competition to encourage innovation, have a kind of ship design competition.
That was one idea that we put out in our peak oil toolbox last year, because New Zealand has a history of it's a maritime nation. We have knowledge of the sea, we have knowledge of small boat building, we have knowledge of wind design. Our wind energy industry is going ahead very, very fast at the moment. We thought a competition for a small freighter doing the Pacific Islands Australia route initially might bring forward some really exciting technological change.
What do you think then when you see so much political time taken up with debates about things like more roading?
Well, I've been frustrated about this for 30 years because it's been obvious since the 70s that this day was going to come sometime round about now. And obviously you couldn't talk about it politically when oil was $10 a barrel. But when oil
because everyone just thought you were a fringe element, those mad greenies all over again.
But it's driven my work in energy efficiency and transport and localisation of food production for the last 30 years. And it's great to see it getting a public airing. Look, since I first went public on this a couple of years ago, things have really changed. The government is bringing out Matt Simmons, author of Twilight in the Desert, the book that has examined carefully all the data about all the oil fields and has concluded that we're very close to peak now. He is the largest energy investment banker in the US. He is not a greenie. He is an advisor to President Bush, and he says civilization is at risk. And who's bringing him to New Zealand next week? The New Zealand government. I see that as a huge step forward from where we were a couple of years ago. But we're not moving fast enough. We're still thinking it's just about what alternative energy are we going to put in our tanks, rather than how we reshape the way we run the economy in our lives to get a worthwhile and satisfying lifestyle on much less energy.
Nick Smith, what is National's response to this?
Well, the first thing is we have a huge amount of cynicism towards the government's proposals of a energy strategy. Let's go back to 2000, when the government announced its energy efficiency strategy. They said that over 10 years we would get a 20% improvement in energy efficiency. 5 years down the track, we've got just 2%. They said that over the 10-year period, there'd be a 30% improvement in use of renewables, things like wind and hydro. And the reality is that we've actually gone backwards. We have more of our energy produced today from coal and petroleum than ever. So I highlight that because it just shows how difficult it is from the centre to be able to, predict and have these fancy, washy strategies about what you're going to do. We should also not underestimate the impact of the market. As a consequence of oil becoming scarcer, the price will rise. And while it is true there will be a period where oil peaks out in terms of production, I don't buy into the doom and gloom theories. I have far more confidence and optimism about the capacity for society to adapt. For instance, we've got fuel at the moment is going up in price, and as it goes up in price, alternatives become far more economic. People buy more hybrid cars. Electric cars that are being produced by Mitsubishi are now becoming viable. We move on in terms of biofuels becoming viable. And so the idea that central government needs to go into a panic mode around this, I think is quite wrong.
But does central government have a role, though, in encouraging people to make those smarter decisions? I mean, in Europe, for instance, if you buy one of those new kind of cars, like the Toyota Prius, then there's a kind of tax incentive. Or you don't have to pay congestion tax when you go into the City of London. These sorts of things.
Yeah, I just think there's a real risk of politicians playing God and picking winners and saying, we think the future is biofuels, or we think the future is electric cars, or we think the future is hybrid cars. And the moment you get into that exercise, I actually think you actually can end up doing more harm than good. Look, mankind has gone through all sorts of periods where we've become very dependent. There was in the 19th century the paranoia that we're going to run out of coal because we've become very coal dependent. Then, unbeknown, petroleum came along and the internal combustion engine. My view is that I'm just far more confident than Jeanette.
So you think something will happen, something will come along, science will save us?
I think there's some sensible things that government can do. Investment in research and technology is important. Making sure, I don't buy Jeanette's argument that we should stop building roads because we think that petroleum's going to run out. Look, we've been building roads since Roman times, and they've proved pretty useful, and they are going to be useful for the next 1,000 years, regardless of the fuel that's used for the motivation.
Yeah, but one of the reasons we're building a lot more roads, and Auckland's a good example of this, is that our cities are sprawling, and it takes people are travelling a lot further every day when they go to and from work.
And I reject the theory that somehow we should have the central government ideology where we say to people, you've got to live in like chicken cage boxes in the central city and not live out in the blocks that you wish to live in. I think that sort of philosophy is quite flawed, and I don't think there is the evidence to show that we're not going to be able to make the transition in terms of electric cars and other means of transport by which the city, whether it be Auckland, Christchurch or Wellington, that we're all going to have to live on top of each other for us to be able to survive in future. There is not that evidence.
Pita Sharples, are you convinced by the evidence?
The Maori Party campaigned on peak oil, and we called for a cross-party party group in Parliament to look at this thing. We think it's very important. I'm at the opposite end of the scale from Nick. In fact, I think Jeanette and Peter Lloyd haven't gone far enough. I think that peak oil is on us now. And when it really hits the world, all sorts of things are going to happen, like war over oil, over the remaining oil. Is almost a certainty. I think here in New Zealand, you see, they talk about getting a different fuel for your vehicles. Well, the work they're doing now, they're using oil to build equipment and cars to try new things. You need to. There won't be enough fuel to build the machinery to take care of a transition. So I think it is a bit of a gloom and doom in the sense that we're not prepared for it and we're not taking it seriously.
Well, and you've got little chance of getting cross-party agreement because, as we've already seen, the National Party is still sceptical about the science here.
No, we accept there's going to be a period of peak oil. What we're simply saying is that do not underestimate the innovative nature of humankind to be able to develop the technologies to be able to make the transition successfully without the collapse. For instance, one of the key theories of peak oil is that suddenly we get to peak oil production, and I agree with David Parker that we're not sure whether it's going to be 2008 or 12 or 2020. We know, for instance, that the Club of Rome estimated in 1972 that it was going to be in 1988, and that didn't happen. The technologies even of being able to extract oil have shifted hugely in the last 30 years. 30 years ago, they said you couldn't dig for oil more than a kilometre deep. They're now going to 8 kilometres deep. All of that's changing as well. And so what we're saying is that the theories of saying that there will be a point of peak oil and this is going to cause some catastrophic collapse in civilization and economies is flawed. As it becomes more shorted, it's going to become more expensive. As it becomes more expensive, that will drive innovation and alternatives.
Look, I think you've got to look at